Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this virtual service of UUCC, the Unitarian Universalist Church of Canandaigua. I'm Eileen Casey Campbell. I'm your minister. And this morning's service is here on Zoom at the link we are now using every week, so you can keep following that same link. And if someone you know misses it, or if you need to leave partway through, we're going to put this service on YouTube after the service is done. So welcome, good morning. I have a couple of quick announcements before we begin. The first is that this morning during our coffee hour time, we'll be hanging out here on Zoom in breakout groups and offering feedback to the board on the covenant we developed as a congregation in the fall. So we'd love for you to hang around, even if it's just for a few minutes, to give your feedback on that covenant. I'm going to put the text of it right into the chat box right now. So if you're online joining us, you can read the text of that covenant in the chat box. And I will read it out loud to you right now in case you're joining us by phone. You've probably gotten it in many forms throughout this church year as it was developed way back in September. So here's the draft covenant as it stands now. We will recognize the inherent value of each person, foster a community of compassion and caring for all, and engage respectfully in disagreement in the service of the values that unite us. So that's the draft of our congregational covenant, and we'll be getting some feedback on that this week, and then next week at our annual meeting, and next week, and then the week after that at our annual meeting, we'll vote on it. So my next announcement is about that annual meeting, which is going to happen on June 7th. So it's 2 Sundays until then. On June 7th, we'll have our annual flower communion service. And I want to encourage you, if you haven't already done so, to please send me pictures of flowers for that service. Some pictures of flowers in your life, whether they're in your yard or you found them in a park, or you stopped by the church and took pictures of our lovely gardens there. Send me by email or text some pictures of flowers. And if your lovely faces are in those pictures too, all the better. And then after our service on June the 7th, we'll have a shortened flower communion service. And immediately after, we're going to hang around and do our congregational meeting, our annual meeting, where we vote on our budget for the year and our new covenant right after the service. And so we're going to try this annual meeting virtually this year. And I think it's going to go really great. We'll have everybody just stick around right after that service. And now for this morning service, let us enter a space of worship together. If you have a chalice at home, I encourage you to grab it. Even if you have to run up and go get it from your computer or your phone, that's fine. Now let's light our chalices together. If you don't have one, I'll light one for all of us. So as we kindle the flame, we recite these words. We gather this hour as people of faith, with joys and sorrows, hopes and needs. We light this beacon of hope, sign of our quest for truth and meaning, in celebration of the life we share together. I want to tell you about the day that I met my friend Lynn. I will always remember that day. I was going to a meeting of a conference planning team on behalf of my boss who couldn't make it, and I didn't know anyone on that team. I arrived a little early and I expected to sit down and ready myself to set up my notepad and maybe get a little glass of water. Instead, I walked into a greeting like I'd never received before, and one that seemed so out of place for the very businessy setting we were in. Lynn, the meeting facilitator, saw me enter quietly, confidently strode across the room and said with a lifetime worth of warmth in a few sentences, "You must be Eileen. You're here. We've been waiting to meet you. We're so glad you're here today." And she just had this orientation of welcome that made me feel instant belonging in a place where, as a substitute meeting representative, I literally did not belong. I have rarely felt so expected and so welcome. And in that one gracious moment, I actually thought to myself, this is why we come to church. This is why any of us comes to church in our heart of hearts. We may be looking for different things on the surface, to do service or justice work, to build new relationships, to heal old wounds. But deep down, we all come here for that sense of radical belonging. We come here to remember and to remind one another that whoever we have been waited for. We are expected. We belong. So however you found us today, welcome. You belong here. I encourage you from your own homes to join with us in singing our opening hymn, Come, Come, Whoever You Are. And now it is time for a story. This morning's story is a Middle Eastern folk tale. And maybe you know that it has for the last month been Ramadan. And this story takes place during Ramadan, and it's about a character named Nasruddin. Now, during Ramadan, devout Muslims fast all day long. So they go from the sunrise until the sunset without eating a single thing. And then at sunset, they feast together in a special kind of feast called an iftar. Now, Mullah Nasruddin, the character in our story, had been working in the fields all day long during Ramadan. And he was sweaty, and his clothes were covered in mud and stains. And because he'd been fasting all day, he was very hungry and very tired. But finally, sundown came, and Nasruddin knew he would soon be able to eat. That evening, the wealthiest man in town had invited everyone to his home for an iftar, where everyone would come and break their fasts there together. And Nasruddin knew that if he went home to change and clean up before going to the party, he would be late. And he didn't want to be late because he didn't want to be rude. And he also didn't want to wait any longer to eat. And he decided it would be better to go to the party with dirty clothes from the fields than to go home first and change into his fine clothes. And so he headed to the party, and he started to imagine all the delicious foods he was going to get to eat. He imagined eating the lentils and the chickpeas, olives and bread, hummus, falafel, and best of all, the desserts, the dates, the figs, the baklava. And when he arrived, the wealthy man opened the door, and he looked at Nasruddin up and down. And without saying anything, he just moved aside so that Nasruddin could enter the house. And he abruptly walked away. So Nasruddin, a little shaken, joined the crowds of people who were all dressed in their very finest clothing. The tables were laid out with beautiful flowers and gorgeous place settings and all the most wonderful types of food, all those foods that Nasruddin had imagined. And despite his efforts, the seats were almost all taken, and nobody moved over to make a space for Nasruddin. In fact, nobody said a greeting to him. Nobody said hello to him. They seemed to be avoiding saying a thing to him at all. They'd glance over at his dirty clothes and hands and face, and then they'd look the other way and start a conversation with their neighbor. The guests ignored him so completely that Nasruddin couldn't even enjoy the food set on the table, and he decided to leave. So he hurried home and he washed up and he changed into his finest clothing, including the most beautiful coat you've ever seen. He put on his coat, and a clean, freshly dressed Nasruddin returned to the feast. This time, the host opened the door, and the wealthy man welcomed him with a huge smile. "Come in, come in," he greeted him. He learned his name. He complimented him on his coat. And Nasruddin entered, and people waved and called him over to come and sit. They made room for him at the table. They learned his name. They complimented him on his coat. Nasruddin sat down quietly, picking up a plump fig. He placed it carefully in his coat pocket. And he patted it and he said, "Eat, coat, eat." Next, he took a handful of chickpeas and he placed them on the shoulder of his coat, and he smushed them into the coat, and he said, "Eat, coat, eat." He fed the coat lentils and olives and bread. He fed the coat hummus and falafel, and best of all, he fed it desserts, the dates and the figs and the baklava. His coat was covered in food. And the partygoers watched his strange behavior with confusion. Soon everyone in the room was staring at Nasruddin and wondering what he was doing. The host hurried over, and this man said, "Nasruddin, what are you doing? Why are you feeding my food to your coat?" "Well," Nasruddin replied, "when I first came to this feast in my old farming clothes and my dirty face and arms, no one would speak to me. But when I changed into this coat, suddenly I had a warm greeting. So I realized it was not me who was welcome at this party, but my fine clothes. And so I'm feeding those clothes the food you have set out." And this is the end of our story. Friends, it's now time for us to share what's on our hearts with one another. In this community, we hold each other in our joys and in our pains, and we share our joys and sorrows freely with one another. So I'm going to invite you to use the chat function here on Zoom, and if you're watching this later on YouTube, to use the comments section down below to share any joys and sorrows that are sitting in your hearts this morning. And know, whatever you're sitting with, we are with you. And we'll begin this morning with a sorrow shared for all the many lives lost to the horror of war on this Memorial Day. I invite you now in our chat box, if you have joys or sorrows, please lift them up and share them with our community now. For all these joys and sorrows, and for anything that is left in silence on our hearts, know that we are together. We are with you in whatever you're holding. And now it's time for us to engage in the spiritual practice of generosity. We make this church work, whether we are together physically or whether we are apart and only together spiritually, emotionally, virtually. We make this church work from the good and generous donations of its people. And so I invite you to give generously to the church as you're able this morning. I'm going to put into the chat box some ways that you're able to do that, both on our website, as well as by mailing a check to the church physically. And in both cases, if you'd like that gift to go to this morning's offering, you can make a note either on the website as you give or on your check itself, that gift should go to the offering for this morning. And in that case, it will be shared with our service partner this month, which is Safe Harbors of the Finger Lakes. We are grateful for the generous gifts of the people of this church. And it's time now for us to enter a period of centering and meditation, followed by shared silence. So I invite you, wherever you are, to get comfortable in your seat. Maybe your feet find the floor, your spine becomes long. You take a deep breath. Maybe your eyes fall closed. And I invite you to be present here. Be present to the smells and sights and sounds and feelings all around you and those inside of you as we center ourselves this morning. I show up and there's always coffee ready. How, I do not know. Not leftover early morning coffee, now cold and burnt in the pot, but good, fresh coffee in its French press, wrapped in a soft towel to stay warm, that I know she brewed with the same tender care with which she brews her every word. Come on in, she'll say, there's coffee ready. Heavy cream will sit in a little metal pitcher beside a jar of turbinado sugar. Sweet delicacies of one kind or another will inevitably adorn the little table. Hallowed offerings when just a sip of water would do. There's always coffee ready. How, I do not know. She would tell you she just drinks too much coffee. It's always freshly made. She eats too many sweets, they're always around. But I know better. I know she lives out her devotion to a love that encircles us all in its wide embrace by doing the same. I know that she has knitted together a life of radical welcome with those gentle hands. I know her most fervent prayer to the love that leaves no one out is, come on in, there's coffee ready. I've been dreaming about parties, big parties like the feast in our story about Nasruddin, intimate dinner parties and game nights and family reunions and picnics and early morning coffee hangouts on my deck. In my dreams, I'm together with my beloveds, sharing food and stories and touch until inevitably I remember mid-dream that, hey, we're not supposed to be doing this. And then, of course, I wake in a panic about the spread of disease and those precious, fragile, real bodies of all those loved ones. Your girl, the extreme extrovert over here, is struggling with how to show love from a distance. But that is what we're called to do right now. Not to return to normal in our church buildings as soon as possible, to be loving, welcoming, radically hospitable while we stay at home, while we maintain our distance. We received a letter last week from Susan Frederick Gray, the president of the Unitarian Universalist Association, letting congregations know, based on our best science, that we should plan to gather virtually until May of 2021. We can hope and pray for a vaccine or a disease treatment that means we might come together sooner, but we will plan conservatively for the safety of our most vulnerable people. I've noticed that we've been averaging more households connecting to our little imperfect blessed worship services than the number of individuals we had been welcoming in person a few months ago. People need us right now, friends. We have a transformative and life-saving message to offer the world. And it's going to take some imagination to figure out how to welcome everyone in this strange new land of virtual church, this place that hardly seems like home to us. What will it look like to be a presence for people who need us and whose presence we need in a world where we cannot be present together at all? It feels like we've been innovators over these last few months of distant church. We've established regular offerings on YouTube and virtual gatherings on Zoom. Some of us are using Zoom for the first time. It's all very new, and we are being brave in our engagement with it. And yet, the honest truth of it is that we haven't begun to innovate. Not yet. We have been brave, certainly, but we're not innovating. We're reacting. We're adapting. We've transplanted the way we had been doing church to a different setting, and it got us through the initial shock of this crisis. But now, as we start to pull back and take a long view of what will likely be a long crisis, it's time to create a new normal for church, new ways to be the church that this world needs right now. What the world has always needed from the church is a brave willingness to build justice right into our welcome. That will never change. And now we get to imagine new ways of doing that in a new and strange world. My colleague C.B. Beale calls this integration of justice and hospitality preemptive radical inclusion. C.B. writes, "Preemptive radical inclusion is a framework for liberation and justice to use when we are in positions of leadership, when we are given or have taken responsibility within a group or organization. It is preemptive because we as leaders are responsible to figure out in advance how to involve everyone in the experience or meeting or gathering or activity. And we make those changes without attendees having to make their needs known, because we have already planned for them. We do this because this is what we want. We want a community that is full and welcoming, a community that creates justice and well-being. The word radical is there in the middle because if leaders, and I mean here those empowered to be in charge, are doing this correctly, the created experience won't be the expected experience. It might even be dramatically, radically different. Inclusion doesn't simply mean that we include others in our circle of what we already do and how we do it, but expand the experience to encourage deep involvement and make that involvement possible. Inclusion without equity and centering the voices of the most marginalized is not inclusion. We involve others in the creation of our projects and communities, and our we becomes larger, and what we do and how we do it transforms into something new. I have another colleague, Evan, who tells a story about the power of hospitality that illustrates this practice so simply. Evan travels to churches across our region regularly for their work, and often they bring their small children with them. On one particular Sunday, the family visited a church, and Evan brought their 5-year-old to wash her hands before coffee hour. She looked around and noted the absence of a stool at the sink. "Why don't they have a stool so I can wash my hands?" she asked. And Evan gave a sort of offhand answer saying, "Oh, I don't know. I guess they just weren't expecting kids." Months later, the family visited a different church. Evan had long forgotten the earlier conversation. They all went to wash up, and the 5-year-old noticed a stool under the sink. "Look," she yelled with delight, "there's a stool! They were expecting me." This is the power of radical hospitality, to make someone feel as though they're exactly who you've been waiting for. Because we have been waiting for them, expecting them, thinking of and making a space for them. Part of the good news of this church is that we can make a space, a life, a community where every person we encounter knows what it is to belong. This is a challenge both new and ancient at once. One of the oldest Bible stories, and one of my favorites, is about Abraham and his hospitality. Abraham, the story goes, lived long, long ago in a land called Canaan. He was a nomad, meaning he traveled from place to place with his big family and herds of animals. They had no permanent house, but they brought tents with them wherever they traveled. It was a dangerous and vulnerable life to be nomads. They were at risk from thieves or criminals. They didn't have long-term communities, so it was hard to know who to trust. Everyone was a stranger, so anyone might be dangerous. One day, Abraham was sitting outside his tent, resting after a long day of work, probably, when he saw some strangers approaching way out in the distance. Now, knowing what we know about the dangerous life of nomads, what would you have done? Run? Hide? Maybe prepare to fight? Well, Abraham didn't run or hide or fight. He got up from his seat and went out into the field to meet those strangers. He invited them back to his tent. And then when they got there, he offered to wash the dirt off their feet and to feed them dinner. "Stay with us for the night," he invited. And only after taking care of the strangers, Abraham realized that they were indeed his God in disguise. He had good reason to be scared of those strangers, but instead of letting fear lead him, he chose welcome and curiosity instead. He chose to widen his circle. He chose to go out and meet the strangers, to offer them care and love. And when he did, he met divinity itself. This is our challenge as we reshape church as we know it. And it's a holy moment indeed. We still tell this story of Abraham some 3,000-ish years later because Jewish people in exile were brave enough to innovate. They took the old folk stories and songs and prayers they had known from before their capture, and for the first time, they wrote them down. Their creative experimentation with technology, writing on scrolls, is what allowed a regional tribal religion to live for thousands of years and span the whole globe. Persecuted early Christians quickly adopted the use of the codex, small pieces of vellum folded into a book, to collect letters from leaders in an easily transportable, easily hidden format in order to spread an anti-imperial message across the entire Roman Empire. Those letters comprise a big chunk of the modern Christian Bible, and the religion survived because of their creative use of strange technology. Radical European Christians in the 14th and 15th centuries, in the wake of decades of plague and the death of nearly half their population, used the printing press to disseminate theological ideas far beyond the centers of power. And with this visionary use of new technology, they grew a movement that drew the circle of inclusion in power wider than it ever had been. Just imagine what we can do with the internet. We have a life-changing, life-saving message of belonging to share with the world. How we share the story of us right now will reshape the church forever. Now is the time to tell our story in a way that is wide enough for anyone to see themselves in it. So how do we go about telling the story that everyone belongs to one another in this strange new world? Imagining this is our work now. Because when we radically include the other, when we use our privilege to prepare a space for others, not just room for them, but a space meant to meet their precise and particular needs, we invite a sacred experience for ourselves too. When we practice the kind of justice that looks like making sure everyone feels expected, we are making our own hearts ready for the miracle of connection. We are making our space, whether it's a physical space or not, a holy space. May it be so.
Draw the circle wide. Draw the circle wide. No one stands alone, we'll stand side by side. Draw the circle wide. Draw the circle wide. Draw it wider still. Let this be our song. No one stands alone, standing side by side. Draw the circle wide. In your sadness and in your grief, all the pain, it seems there's no reprieve. We will hold you until the storm subsides. Draw the circle wide. Draw the circle wide. Draw it wider still. Let this be our song. No one stands alone, standing side by side. Draw the circle wide. Draw the circle wide. Draw it wider still. Let this be our song. No one stands alone, standing side by side. Draw the circle wide. Draw the circle wide.
Oh, how I long to be with you, swaying and clapping to Bill's music in person. But we will learn how to pray in a strange land. Our words of benediction come from C.B. Beale. They say, all the people are my people. We all get free together. I invite you from your own homes to join with us in singing our closing hymn, we're going to sit at the welcome table. Now we extinguish our chalices together. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. Those we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Thank you for being together this morning. Thank you for being the church this morning.